welcome 6th grade history students to our continued study of Japan. Today we are going to talk some about the Heian period. We're going to talk about life at the court, language, literature, and art. And then our next video will talk about religion and government and feudal Japan. Okay, so let's get started. The Japanese government established a capital at the city of Nara in 710. Oh, I forgot to say we're on page 352 in your book and 193 in your workbook. Okay, so their first permanent capital was at Nara in 710. Nara was a beautiful city, well planned out. Later on, they moved the capital to Heian-kyo. Heian-kyo is today the city of Kyoto in Japan. After the capital was moved to Heian-kyo, this began a period known as the Heian period in Japanese history. This is a period that is well studied by historians, and it was a time in Japanese history that was peaceful and secure. And it was during this time that Japan began to develop a culture that was independent of the Chinese culture. Prior to that, they were heavily influenced by Chinese culture. But during the Heian period, they began to sort of branch out on their own. And some things that we know or we think of as typically Japanese kind of began during this period. The emperor, when he moved to Heian-kyo, had, of course, a bunch of nobles that followed him there. This group of nobles was known as the imperial court. When you see the word imperial, it has to do with an emperor and an empire, okay? So this was the imperial court. They served the emperor and acted as his advisors. Life at the imperial court was very complicated and very difficult. There was this very strict set of rules for behavior. This was known as etiquette. Nowadays, when we talk about etiquette, we're talking about the rules for how you behave in certain situations. It's basically the same thing. But it was a lot more complicated for these Japanese imperial members of the imperial court. Their rules of etiquette included rules for everything. I mean, all of their actions and all of their responses for every possible type of behavior. Our book says, whether accepting a piece of food or meeting the emperor, there were rules for everything, for every action that you took. One of the biggest rules, and this is kind of interesting how this has continued to influence Japanese culture to this day, at least from what I've read. Maybe some of my friends who are more knowledgeable about Japanese culture can help me with this. But one of the things one of the ways they had to behave was that if you were in the court, you were supposed to always behave with composure. That meant that you could not show your emotions at any time, whether good or bad. You always maintained an air of being composed. If you didn't follow the rules, you were not welcome at court. So whatever the rules were for, eating, meeting the emperor, and everything in between, you had to follow those rules or you weren't welcome at the court. One of the hallmarks of this period, and I think this is kind of a hallmark of every Golden Age period, is that the nobles at the court were very interested in beauty. Many of them supported the arts. They were patrons of the arts. The court was the center of culture and of learning during this time period. And like I said just a second ago, the Heian period became the golden age of the arts in Japan. The Heian period is very important. When you study art history, if you're able to study anything about Japan, this is what you're going to learn. The Heian period was very full of artistic endeavors. One of the things that I think is kind of cool is the Heian nobles didn't just want art surrounding them, they wanted it on them. So they paid close attention to their own appearance and to the way they looked and the way they dressed. And some of the things, just like some of the other things we've studied, some of their fashion choices, you are going to go, really? Ew, weird. Okay, but we have some weird fashion choices of our own. Now, every period of history has its own interesting fashion. One of the things they really loved was really elaborate outfits. For instance, women in the imperial court in Heian, Japan, wore long gowns, and the gowns were made out of 12 layers of colored silk. 12 layers of colored silk. And the reason they were made of all these different layers was because as they walked and as the wind blew, then their skirts would kind of flutter around them and it would show the different layers and the different colors as they walked. The other interesting thing, and this is not in your book, I'm giving you this for a freebie. This is called, they practiced what was called ohaguro. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but I looked it up. It's spelled O-H-A-G-U-R-O, ohaguro. And ohaguro is the practice of blackening your teeth. During the Heian period, white teeth were considered ugly. And so they blackened them. One of the ways was basically a tea. They would take iron shavings, iron filings, and soak it in water until the water turned black. And then they would add different things to make it taste not so bad. And then they would drink it, and that would dye their teeth. I read a couple of other interesting things. You had to do this every day or every other day in order to keep your teeth black. But there have been skeletons found that had black teeth. So at some point it becomes permanent. One of the other things I read said that that it actually helped prevent cavities. Whatever it was that they were doing to dye their teeth. Now, some of them painted their teeth. This practice is still used in certain circles, but it did fall out of favor in the late 19th century. Nobles would also carry fans. One of the things I brought back from Washington, D.C. for Bethy the last time I went was a fan that had cherry blossoms on it, because the cherry trees in Washington, D.C. were a gift from the country of Japan, and so you can often find things with a cherry blossom motif in Washington, D.C., and so I bought her this fan. But the Japanese would carry these fans. They were painted, usually. They were usually painted with a scene of trees or river. A hand-painted fan was very, very fashionable. During the Heian period, the Japanese nobles were very careful about how they wrote and how they spoke. And that has a lot to do with the etiquette and the culture of saving face and of keeping your composure, right? So you think about every word. I know I have some students that are like, yeah, that wouldn't bother me, I could do that, and other students are like, nope, can't do that, gotta say everything I'm thinking, right? So some of you would not last long in the imperial court, others of you might do quite well. But Chinese was the official language of used by men in the imperial court. And Japanese scholars would spend many, many years learning Chinese. Chinese is not an easy language to learn, especially to write. To be literate, to be able to read and write Chinese, you have to learn, I think, something like 2,000 characters, different characters, in order to just be literate, which is kind of mind-blowing to me, and I have the highest respect for anyone who learns Chinese as a second language, even as a first language. The Japanese had a language that was common that they spoke, but they didn't have a written language of their own. And the Japanese language differed greatly from the Chinese language. In the Heian period, the Japanese began to include phonetic alphabets into their own writing system. And because of that, their writing system is different from Chinese, and it continues to be very difficult to master today. I have a friend who knows Chinese because he began learning it as a small child. And I don't know that he's lost probably some of it because he hasn't used it in a while. But it was always interesting to watch him do Japanese calligraphy. During the Heian period, writing was very popular. It was a very popular pastime, and it was especially popular with women. It had a lot of female authors. Women were not trained in Chinese writing, so they wrote in the common Japanese language. They would, since they weren't allowed to work outside the home, they would spend a lot of their leisure time writing, and they would write about their experiences in the court. And kind of unlike a lot of other ancient cultures, most of the writing that survived from the Heian period is by women. Now, most of our ancient cultures will have, maybe one or two female authors that have kind of survived, but overall, the bulk of authorship was male up until, well, fairly recently. But during the Heian period, pretty much nearly all of it that survived literature from the Heian period was written by women. One of the most important authors during this time period was a woman named Murasaki Shikibu. Murasaki Shikibu. You can see a statue of her on page 353 in your book. She was a lady at the court, and she wrote what many people consider to be the world's first novel. And her novel is known as, here we go, is called The Tale of Genji. And this is a story of Prince Genji and his life and the loves that he had and all of the things that he did. This is a very long novel. I looked it up, and it's long. It's really big. Our book says that you can get a modern edition that is 4,000 pages long. So this is not a short book. I imagine most of the time if you were to get a copy, it would be an abridged version. I can't imagine the whole thing being published frequently, but I'm sure you can probably get it. But modern publishers tend to condense things like that. Poetry was also very important, and many of you already know or think you know what a haiku is, right? Haiku is one type of Japanese poetry, and it was very popular then, and it is still popular today. Haiku is that short little form of poetry that has 17 syllables and something called a kigo. A kigo is a word in the poem that sort of tells you or hints at what season the poem is in which the poem is taking place. So when you have a haiku, it's not just 575 for syllables, and it's not just 17 total. To be a true haiku, it needs to be something about nature, and it needs to give a mood or give you a picture of what's going on. Now, if you were to go to Japan, you would see that even today, Chinese art is reflected in traditional Japanese art and architecture. But the Japanese developed their own art as well. So it's kind of like the Chinese maybe got them started, gave them some ideas, and then they just developed on their own. One of the biggest characteristics of Chinese art is the use of colors. Japanese artists loved brilliant colors, bright colors. In architecture, they would use the bright colors to decorate their houses and their temples. And a second important characteristic of Japanese art is the use of everyday objects, everyday things. The Japanese wanted everything that they used to be beautiful, no matter what it was. And so fans, combs, boxes, baskets, all of these everyday things that they would use would be painted or made in some way to be beautiful. They didn't just want useful things. They wanted things to be beautiful as well. Another art form very popular in Japan is ikebana, or yeah, I think it's called ikebana. It was an art form that involved flower arranging. And flowers were chosen very carefully, the kind of flower and the color of the flower to match the occasion and the season. One particular flower that's very popular in Japan is the chrysanthemum. And chrysanthemums are used during the month of May. Every year they had a chrysanthemum festival, and this was when the emperor would go out and inspect the flower gardens. There was one emperor who adopted the chrysanthemum as his official seal and his official crest, and this seal and this crest are still used today. I looked it up, and the official seal of Japan is still used today. You can see on 354 the imperial crest, a picture, that gold stylized chrysanthemum flower. Heian-kyo, was a beautiful city, and the nobles worked to keep it that way. Because they admired Chinese architecture, they modeled it after a particular Chinese city, Chang'an, or I think that's how that's pronounced. They copied building styles, especially for temples, and the pagoda is one that you'll often see. For other buildings, they liked designs that were simple and were airy, had lots of windows and lots of spaces for the breeze to flow through. And they would surround them with beautiful gardens. Japanese gardening is something that continues to be popular everywhere around the world today. In fact, you can go to Portland. There is a Japanese garden in Portland that you could go visit this summer, so that you could see the very particular style of gardening that the Japanese use. I think you'll find it really beautiful, and I hope that if you go, you will let me know and maybe share some photographs with me. Now, the next video that we're going to study, like I said, we're going to cover religion and government and feudal Japan and the Mongols. So stay tuned for that. And Oasis is here today, and he absolutely insisted that I say this. So, guys, be sure to like and subscribe. Have a great day.